Welcome back to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. So this is the first episode of an accelerated series I'm calling 111 Critical Battles, or 11-1 Critical Battles if you're a Lord of the Rings nerd like me. This series is going to explore some of those battles that are particularly important to the study of military history, either because of their impact on history or because they changed the game in some way. So this episode, we're going to run into the first real-life character you might have heard of if you took world history in an American high school. Or maybe not. I'm pretty sure the only Bronze Age figure I learned about by name was Hammurabi, who's still several centuries in the future for us. Yeah, that's my clumsy way of introducing Sargon of Akkad. Certainly not the first empire builder in Mesopotamia. We've already run into a couple of empire builders in both of our previous episodes about the region, but maybe the first one to extend his empire outside the Fertile Crescent and the Persian Gulf. But before we can introduce Sargon, we need to run down a few of the military developments in the region since the last time we talked. These are campaigns we know about, but we really have no details for. So as important as they were to the people involved, you're not going to gain much if I spend a lot of time on them. So here's a fast forward on the 100 or so years between the Battle of Umma and Sargon's rise. I hinted several times in the last episode that Ian Adam spent several years conquering his neighbors after he smacked down Umma. First, he took most of Sumer, including the cities of Ur, Nippur, Akshak, Larsa, and Uruk. Not satisfied with that, he ranged east into Elam, part of what would become Persia and later Iran. He named himself King of Kish, the capital of Elam, but his conquest, as we talked about last week, didn't stay quiet for very long after his death. Sometime after Ian Adam died, as well as Enekale, the client king he installed in Umma, Umma rose up against Lagash again. This time it was Enekale's successor, Ur-Luma, who rose up against Ian Adam's son, Enenadam I. He doesn't appear to have been much more successful than Isurdu was, but Enenadam doesn't seem to have spanked him quite as hard as Ian Adam did. Possibly because he was also dealing with uprisings in other cities at the same time. Around the same time as Ian Adam's conquest, possibly even before, Lugal Anamundu of Adab was busy building his own empire. The exact timeline of his reign is unclear, and what we have is based on records from almost 1,000 years later. But it looks like he at least conquered Ur, and may have reached east into Elam and north into modern Lebanon, what the records call the land of cedars. The source that mentions him also says that he ruled for 90 years, so take that for what it's worth. But, like Ian Adam, his empire looks like it fell apart upon his death. It's a pattern that seems to be pretty common for the region. In fact, a source called the Sumerian Kings List seems to show the kingship of Sumeria more or less rotating among the city-states based on which one was strong enough to compel obedience from the others. If that's the case, maybe the Sumerians had something like what the Celts of Britain would later call a high king, a king recognized by the other kings as their leader, but only inasmuch as they chose to follow him, maybe. At any rate, war seems to have been pretty endemic among the Sumerian city-states. But it seems to have been low-level war most of the time, kings carrying their disputes onto the battlefield with no particular intent to do any irreparable harm, except, of course, to the guys they killed. Even when we hear of a city being destroyed, it's usually back to being a major player a decade or so later. So somehow, in an age when the king and all his troops might be massacred when they lost a battle, the cities themselves seem to have continued on without a hitch. And speaking of endemic warfare, you knew damn well you hadn't heard the last of Umma, right? So Enenadam put down Ur-Luma's rebellion, but that didn't stop Umma's next king, Il, from rebelling against Enenadam's son, Enmetena. Yeah, the guy who commissioned the Stele of Vultures. And Metena put down this rebellion, looks like with the help of Uruk. It's an interesting side note that several of these rebellions seem to have started when the king of Umma ordered the boundary levee between the states destroyed by redirecting the flow of water over it. See, one of the amazing things about the country we call Iraq today is that as hot as the climate is, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers is crisscrossed with canals. And these canals allow the people to grow dates and rice and other crops. When I was there, I heard the canals dated back to the time of Alexander, which is impressive enough. But as I've studied more of the region's history, it's become clear to me that the canals were at least as old to Alexander as Alexander is to us. And they had enough control over the flow of water that a king could order it diverted to wash away a boundary dike. And nobody thought that was a particularly remarkable thing for him to do. But moving on, we have Lugal-Zaghazi, the last independent Sumerian king. He came up as the governor of Umma sometime around the 2350s BCE, made an alliance with Uruk, who in those days seems to have pretty much sided with whoever they thought was going to win the fight, and finally beat down Lagash and ended the war. It turned out it was over once and for all, but that wasn't entirely his doing. More on that later. After Uruk and Lagash, he appears to have extended his control over all of Sumer. There's that high kingship idea again. And claimed to have extended his rule across all the lands between the upper and the lower seas, or from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. This claim was probably an exaggeration, especially since Akkad would have been within Zaghazi's empire. But he may have sent troops raiding that far, and then he became irrelevant, and then dead at the hands of the guy we're talking about today. So who was Sargon of Akkad? And what makes him more noteworthy than any of the other kings in the Near East who sought to elevate themselves above their neighbors? For one, he's the guy later sources decided to write about. We have his name from Babylonian, Hittite, and Assyrian sources, as well as from the Hebrew Bible. A couple of Assyrian kings even took the name Sargon, presumably in his honor. He seems to have been something of a legend to later would-be empire builders. It's not clear where he came from. The Sumerian king list said he was the son of the cupbearer to the king of Kish, and he conquered Uruk around 2334 BCE, capturing and killing Zaghazi, and later maybe founding the city of Akkad somewhere. Archaeologists apparently haven't found it yet, but the empire he's about to build will bear its name, the Akkadian Empire. Sargon's origin story is a little crazy, so I'm going to share it here. According to an autobiography that he seems to have commissioned, he was born to what he calls a changeling, which historians think may have been a priestess of Ishtar, the goddess he eventually took as his patron. How he knew who his mother was isn't clear, because she apparently put her newborn in a basket and floated him down the river. Now, where have I heard that story before? Seems like that was a pretty popular method of getting rid of unwanted infants in the Bronze Age. Anyway, he was fished out of the river by a gardener named Aki, who worked for Ur-Zababa, king of Kish. We don't know the name Aki gave him, but it wasn't Sargon. That was a name he took sometime after he started his campaigns of conquest, a name that means legitimate king or rightful king. Somehow, young Sargon caught the attention of the king, who made him his cupbearer. To our modern ears, that sounds like a menial role, but to a Sumerian king in the 24th century BCE, it seems like it combined the duties of a servant with those of a trusted advisor. The cupbearer had the king's ear in a way that made him one of the most powerful men in the city. So, when Ur-Zababa learned that Zaghazi was marching on Kish, Sargon was apparently the logical man for a diplomatic mission to ask him to leave the city alone. So, no shit, there he was. The mission seems to have been a double cross because it looks like part of the message was a request for Zaghazi to kill Sargon. Zaghazi declined, but probably later wished he hadn't. We'll get to that. But the problem with being the kind of leader who double crosses talented subordinates is that eventually it's going to backfire on you. Sargon, astutely observing that his career with Ur-Zababa was in the shitter, turned around and marched back with Zagasi, and with Sargon's help, Zagasi took the city easily. I like to imagine something like a Monty Python skit here, where Sargon approaches the gates at night, convinces the guard, who of course knows him, to open the gate and ignore the platoon of troops behind him, tells the guard to run off and spend a nice evening with his wife and kids, then throws the gate wide so Zagasi and his army can march right in. However it happened, Zagasi and Sargon together took the city, and Ur-Zababa ran off into hiding. But however warmly the relationship between Zagasi and Sargon started, it went south quickly, which makes it look like maybe Sargon was the problem in these relationships after all. You know how the saying goes, if you run into an asshole, you just ran into an asshole. But if everybody you meet is an asshole, maybe the asshole is you. But, asshole or not, Sargon appears to have marched against Uruk and taken it without orders. Maybe he acquired a kernel of loyal troops around which he could build his own army, then decided he had learned all he could from Zagasi and was ready to embark on his own campaign of conquest. Zagasi seems to have been perturbed at this development, so he marched against Sargon. And Sargon kicked his ass. Not just your garden variety ass kicking. This was a full-on curb stomp, knock you on your ass and jump up and down on your neck lesson in the nature of moral authority. Not only did Sargon defeat Zagasi militarily, he captured him, put him in chains, and marched his ass through the city of Nippur, which was dedicated to Zagasi's patron god Enlil, who was also Ian Adams' patron, by the way. And that is the story of the Battle of Uruk. No details, just like most of what we've seen up till now. So, we're going to have to keep going with Sargon and see what else we can learn. As far as I can tell, the sources don't say he killed Zagasi, but there's a stele that shows Zagasi in chains with a mace coming down on his head. Seems like if you want to send the message that there's a new sheriff in town, not only is the old guy history, but his gods suck as well, you march him in chains through a town dedicated to his favorite god and smash his brains out on the altar where he might have made sacrifices to that very god. A powerful message and kind of a dick move. So maybe Sargon was the asshole after all. But, asshole or not, Sargon had just conquered Zagasi's empire. He claimed a new patron, the goddess the Sumerians called Inanna and the Akkadians called Ishtar, who appears to have been kind of a spiritual ancestor to the Greek goddess Aphrodite. Of course, the other kings of Sumerian cities didn't realize Sargon was playing a completely new game. When they learned Zagasi was out of the way, they did just what they had always done and rose up, expecting Sargon to earn his place as king of Uruk and lord over the rest of them, allowing him to hold power only as long as he could prove it militarily. And by the rules of their game, nobody who came from roots as humble as his could even be a legitimate ruler. But Sargon wasn't interested in playing their same old game. He didn't want to be king of Uruk and first among a gaggle of squabbling kings. He wanted to be the undisputed heavyweight champion. So, he sent another message. After smacking down everybody who called himself a king and decided to rise up against him, he built, or possibly rebuilt, a new capital for himself. A capital no other dynasty could lay claim to. And he made it clear that he was not going to just be the biggest bear in the forest. Before long, Akkadian garrisons occupied every city in Mesopotamia. Akkadian governors took the place of the old kings. For the first time, the region had a single ruler and a single code of laws. He also developed infrastructure wherever he went. His empire built roads, improved irrigation, sponsored the arts, and even implemented the world's first postal system. Maybe because he came from humble beginnings and legitimately cared about the people he ruled. Or maybe because it's hard for the former elites to restore the old order when the common people are happy with the new. Or more likely a combination of the two. Regardless, he seems to have been interested in actual governance as much as conquest. Then he turned his attention to the rest of the world, or at least as much of it as he could reasonably have known. One of his tablets claims he was victorious in 34 battles, a staggering total, even if the real number is only half of that. To put it in perspective, Alexander himself is credited with 20 victories, Hannibal with 30 or so, Julius Caesar with probably 20, Subotai, the great Mongol general, with 28, the Duke of Wellington with 34, and Napoleon with about 70. Most great generals clock in at fewer than a dozen, largely because most of them made their reputations in one or two wars that encompass less than a decade of actual campaigning. Military life is hard, even for the generals, and most can't sustain it for decades the way Hannibal and Napoleon did. So, where did Sargon fight? His campaigns took him east to Elam in modern-day Iran, north to present-day Syria, where he destroyed the city of Mari, then north and east to the cities of Ashur and Nineveh, then north and west from there. His conquest may have stretched across Syria and Lebanon, including parts of Jordan and Israel all the way to the Mediterranean. He may have pressed north into Asia Minor or Anatolia, the country we call Turkey today. There is some evidence he invaded the island of Cyprus, and he may even have sent ships trading as far as India. It was probably some time in this period that he took the name Sargon, which, as we've already mentioned, means rightful king. You'd think a name like that might have been helpful PR as the elites of Mesopotamia were resisting his rise and conquest of their region. But Sargon is not a Sumerian name, it's Semitic. We think of Semites today as the Jewish ethnicity, but the Semitic peoples were the ancestors of both the Jews and the Arabs, especially the peoples of the eastern Mediterranean region called the Levant, which includes Israel, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. So it may be that he was a Semite himself, or that he took the name to make his rule more palatable to the Semitic peoples of that region. But you have to wonder a little bit about a guy who names himself rightful king. How did the region really take that? Well, how would we take it if some dude got elected and started calling himself real president? Honestly, it would probably depend on what kind of results he managed to accomplish, because conquest is not just a game of friendly-sounding names. So what was it that made Sargon irresistible militarily? It's a little hard to identify any definite military innovations we can trace to Sargon. He implemented the world's first standing army, 5,400 soldiers who ate their daily meal with their king every day, so they had daily contact with him. That made them elites. A few sources suggest he made archers a prominent part of his army after centuries of neglect. Remember that the earlier sources like Gilgamesh don't mention archers, even though we know the Sumerians had bows. Archers would be a powerful counter to chariots, especially the kind of slow and clumsy chariots the Sumerians used. But that's about all I can find. The rest of his innovations may have had to do with making his rule preferable for would-be subjects than his predecessor's rule. It's clear he was, or at least became, a very charismatic leader. Yes, it's possible to be both an asshole, hated by your peers and superiors, and a charismatic leader loved by your subordinates. Think Julius Caesar. It's also possible to be loved by your superiors and hated by your subordinates and still be successful. Think Douglas MacArthur, at least until he challenged President Truman. So part of Sargon's appeal may have been that in an age of unaccountable autocratic kings, he invited input from his subordinates and trusted them to carry out their missions without micromanagement. This would have fostered a spirit of initiative that made his armies flexible, as a local commander could take advantage of an opportunity without waiting for approval. This kind of flexibility would have contributed to victory, as his forces would always be able to act more quickly than those of his opponent. And victory, especially when soldiers at all levels feel like they contributed, breeds a kind of esprit de corps that's hard to beat, a kind of momentum that makes soldiers feel even more invincible. And soldiers that feel invincible are more likely to fight hard to stay that way. He also seems to have incorporated religion into his military practices and his governance in ways that his predecessors hadn't. I'll let social historians do the detailed interpretation here, but it looks like he may have implemented a subtle tweak in the way his people thought about his relationship with the gods. Instead of claiming himself as ordained by a particular god, and thereby infallible by Sumerian religious understanding, he may have claimed to be simply acting in the name of Ishtar, more the tool of the goddess than her representative on earth. Such a relationship may have meant that for his soldiers to do his will meant they were also doing the will of Ishtar, which would have given them agency in the same way his trust in their initiative and judgment did. I'm certainly no expert in ancient Mesopotamian religion, so this is just my idea about how to interpret some of what I read for this episode. But it makes sense to me that if other rulers are telling their people they're powerless and need to just do what they're told, maybe the one who's telling them they can take a hand in their own destiny might have an advantage. But however charismatic he was, however invincible his troops felt, it didn't keep him safe from rebellion. In the final years of his reign, he seems to have had to beat down a general uprising from several of the Sumerian cities. That's about all we know about it, so it wasn't something he felt worthy of remembrance. Either he put it down quickly and decisively, or it came so close to destroying his empire that he had his scribes strike it from the records to preserve his reputation for invincibility. According to him, of course, it was the former. He mentioned the uprising in what historians call his autobiography. In my old age of 55, all the lands revolted against me, and they besieged me in Akkad. But the old lions still had teeth and claws. I went forth to battle and defeated them. I knocked them over and destroyed their vast army. Now any king who wants to call himself my equal wherever I went, let him go. So, in a single passage, he dismisses the rebellion, and he also takes the opportunity to talk a little shit for the benefit of any king who thinks he can measure dicks against Sargon the Great. His reign lasted anywhere from 34 to 56 years, depending on which source you choose to believe. A respectable span even at the lower end. And Sargon doesn't seem to have wasted much of whatever time he had. He managed to lay the foundation for an empire that lasted more than 200 years. Far from the longest-lived empire we'll talk about, but certainly worth noting in the volatile climate of the Bronze Age Near East. So, Sargon the Great passed into history, but every dynasty that came after him, from the later Akkadians to the Hittites to the Babylonians to the Assyrians, held up his reign as an example of what a real conqueror looked like. And for the third week in a row, we don't have any details to analyze for any of Sargon's 34 battles. This is becoming a pattern. I'm going to have to start talking about something else in this section. Forms of maneuver or something. So, that's it for Sargon of Akkad. Next week, we'll be looking at a battle that happened during Sargon's reign and within the boundaries of his empire, but that he doesn't seem to have been involved in. The Battle of Turka around 2300 BCE, when a coalition of 3 cities got together to punish Mari for encroaching on their turf. If you enjoyed this video, I'd like to remind you to click that thumbs up and subscribe to War Stories and Fairy Tales. And don't forget to tell your friends about us. Until next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.